Chapter 4, Fire Hornets. Part 4 of 4. The scientist adjusted his half-moon spectacles, which he wore out of habit from his human days, to peer at what he saw as one mustard-yellow unicorn stallion, 2 earth stallions, and 1 black Pegasus mare. He sighed with indifference as he took his glasses off to rub the lenses with a cloth from his pocket. He spoke equish in a lofty, if difficult tone. It seems the gods were right in accelerating things. While I care little about you four personally, I can only imagine that if you're here, then your government's military isn't far behind. He replaced his glasses over his eyes. So tell me, who are you? British? French? Toon knew he was stalling for time. Stand down, and I'll make sure your death is painless. Garduth tisked at her a few times while pacing back and forth one time before returning to the center. I fear I bleed no longer, for he has no sway over my soul. Even if I should die, I will return anew, forever out of his grasp. Conrad snorted derisively. Why does every cultist everywhere always say that? The Mayan smirked. Ah! Judging by your accent, I'd say you're American. Gods know you lot can't stop sticking your noses in the world's business where it doesn't belong. I dare say if the mouthpiece had not arrived when he did, America would have been in more wars within 10 years than England has in its entire history. Conrad had had enough. We didn't come here to talk. He bolted forward, ready to plant his hooves across the Mayan's jaw. Nor did I, Garduth replied calmly as he focused on the Pegasus and shot a wave of crackling sickly green energy from his forehead. Conrad tried to reverse his momentum, but the wall was too fast and it pushed him back through the air. The wall faded shortly after contact and the Pegasus landed back on his hooves nearly right back where he began. I'm afraid I can't allow you to disturb the seeding process. It's in its final stages and will depart shortly. After that you can have the run of the place for all I care. Alexia had no qualms about killing a Mayan. No matter how civilized this one acted, they were all brainwashed zealots in her eyes. Then it seems like we don't have time to waste on your welcoming committee anymore. Toon grabbed a hold of the scientist with her kinesis and was about to slam him against the walls until he stopped moving when the same green pulse of energy radiated from his forehead and he dropped back down to the ground, only to dust off his pants before standing back up again. I half expected that not to work. I will need to inform the others of its success when I return to headquarters after we're done here. The ponies were stunned that Alexia's kinesis was repulsed, but the disguised alicorn quickly recovered. You really expect to leave here alive, Mayan? Your gods won't save you from us. He huffed at the venom in her words. I suppose followers of the more established religions take comfort in giving their mythological rivals pejorative connotations, so I will let that slide on account of your ignorance. That ignorance will not last much longer, he added with a sinister grin. Of that, I assure you. Be grateful your kind has garnered the Corradists' interest, rather than their ire. Alexia was not willing to waste any more words and forged a 12-meter-long needles of solidified mana and threw them at the scientist. Oipla outstretched his hand and a hemisphere of green light surrounded him. Upon impact the needles destabilized and washed over him as nothing more than intangible motes of light. Having fought against you unicorns for some time now, and working with a helpful few, we've had plenty of time to perfect our own counters to magic. After all, spells are only held together by willpower and exacting specific matrices, are they not? Subvert your will and the spell falls apart. Like he turned around to see the last few fading motes of mana. So many dancing lights. He turned back around to face them with a calculating grin. I'm actually quite happy someone like you arrived. The nagging thought that our allied unicorns were holding back was always at the back of my mind. I thank you for proving me wrong. It's a rare event and I will savor this moment for decades to come. Loki glanced at Crimson and nodded before both mares walked towards the walls. Savor this. Both earth ponies gathered their mana and bucked the walls. A few moments passed without anything visibly happening. Garduth tilted his head in amusement. Am I supposed to be intimidated by physical prowess? Loki sat on her haunches and yawned lazily. No. With only a brief moment of rumbling earth as a warning, twin spikes of rock and stone speared out of the walls and impaled the scientist in both the head and chest. He was dead before the first drop of blood hit the ground. Loki rubbed her chin contemplatively. Do you think he was intimidated in the end? Toon started running forward. You can figure that out later when we stop the transfer. The rest bounded after her, with Loki lingering just long enough to study the Mayan's surprised expression before joining her mates. Alexia reached the door and was about to turn to Loki to open it, but she noticed the keypad was smoking. Damn, looks like he overloaded the door. He really wasn't expecting to leave alive, was he? The lone stallion tapped the open button on the opposite side of the door frame to at least be able to say he tried the obvious. When it failed, he turned to the silver mare. Can you teleport us inside? The alicorn grimaced as she remembered the bunker under the White House. It would be risky. I have no idea what's on the other side and I have no way to craft a diagram to scry what's inside. We could materialize on top of a bunch of landmines or into a vat of acid. Teleportation will only correct itself if any of us would reappear inside a solid object. Coming up with a new plan, Conrad bucked the keypad off the wall to expose the wires within. Loki, think you can hotwire the door? Damn it, I'm a hacker, not an electrician. Besides, did you just forget Mr. Swiss Cheese back there? Loki demonstrated her point by gently pushing Alexia back away from the door. She reared up and gathered a large amount of mana in her hooves before crashing back down on the ground, and the earth in front of her ripped its way out from under the steel floor and pierced the door enough to see through. Or at least it was once Loki kicked the shard of stone and caused it to crumble into gravel. You guys need to think outside the box more often. Conrad grunted in amusement. What do you think we have you for? Too true, Loki replied as she stepped aside for Alexia to peer through the hole. She heard a multitude of noises and all of them were unpleasant. She could identify the sound of breaking bones, slurping liquids and groans of joyful messy eating. The alicorn scowled. Be ready for a fight, and probably something nasty from those videos we saw. After finding a good spot and her mates gathering around her, Toon teleported the group inside. What they found were that all of the failed test subjects had been let out of their tanks and were gorging themselves on the remains of the human captives. Although the equines could only guess at what the subjects' meal was because none of the chunks of flesh were identifiable anymore. The mystery didn't last long. 2 Pegasi researchers finished attaching the last 2 crates containing the virus to the ceiling-mounted cargo conveyor and noticed the 4 Americans at the far end of the room. The first scientist escorted the cargo out of the room while the second found a microphone to speak to the agents via the public address speakers. I hope you enjoy our pets. We let them feed on the cattle, but they are still growing, so don't expect them to ignore fresh meat when it happens to present itself. Toon snarled and yelled back at him. Well, let's test that theory, shall we? She selected 2 random enforcers, gripped them in her magic and flung them at the Pegasus sitting at the cargo controls. The scientist took wing as the 2 howling enforcers landed where the pony had just been sitting. The bestial creatures moved to grab him, but stopped as they sniffed the air. A moment later the enforcers ignored the researcher and turned away to return to their meal. It was a good plan, I'll grant you, said the smug Pegasus. But they know who their masters are. The researcher hit a button and the massive steel doors started closing. He turned back to say one last sarcastic word before it closed. Farvel. The 2 enforcers that had been thrown across the room were shaken out of their blind march to the piles of meat when the heavy steel doors slammed shut. They turned and looked at the 4 ponies and all of the fresh meat they represented. The bigger of the 2 howled a guttural sound that was more akin to a loud growl than anything else. As one, the others turned to their new prey. Conrad stepped forward to place himself between Alexia and the bipedal brutes. We don't have time for this. Loki produced a glass mason jar and tossed it up and down in her hoof. This looks like a job for my fire hornets. The others turned to the green mare with a shared question. Wait, what? Fire in the hole. Loki threw the jar and it smacked one of the enforcers square in the face. Bingo! The green mare's cheer faded in an instant and bypassed bothered, scared, and went straight on to full-on terror as to what she had just done. Oh Alex, could you cast a heat shield around us or something? Like right now? As in now. The liquid in the broken jar flared to life as a raging purple fire that covered the howling enforcer head to toe. Scant seconds later, buzzing embers of liquid fire leapt off of the burning corpse and latched onto every other enforcer in the room and tried to reach the herd, but Toon's ward kept the Hornets at bay. The test subjects were not so fortunate and all of them burned away to cinders within moments. The Hornets were not content with just the failed Mayan strain, and were starting to bounce all over the room, setting everything on fire. Conrad glared at Loki. What the hell was that? Run now, talk later, Alexia cried as she bolted the 100 meters between her and the cargo delivery dock on the far side of the lab. The heat shield was not designed with prolonged casting or enduring stability in mind, only instant protection, and it failed before she reached the door controls. Toon screeched to a halt at the controls to find which one opened the giant steel portal. Loki eyed the fire behind them as it rapidly consumed everything in its path. I guess I should have remembered this earlier, but fire hornets should never be used in an enclosed area with no access to the outside, like ever. The traces of snaking fire shot every which way, spreading flames in all directions. Most alarmingly was that the hornets themselves were moving rapidly towards the herd at a frightening speed. Fortunately there were only a handful of buttons on the control panel and Toon quickly found the correct one. The heavy doors opened and the herd galloped through the exit. The hornets were too close to risk trying to close the door behind them, so the ponies galloped as fast as they could down the long straight hallway. Conrad felt faster in the air, flew up and over the herd to be adjacent to the green mare. What the hell did you throw? Loki poured on as much speed as she could muster, knowing full well what her creation was capable of. I told you they're fire hornets, didn't I? That's not an answer. He glanced at the streams of living fire that clawed its way past the door and started charging after the ponies like a swarm of locust to wheat. He cursed and saved his breath to match the mare's pace. They were coming up on the two Pegasi researchers who were riding on top of the cargo crate as it zipped along the ceiling. One of them looked behind him and saw the 4 agents being chased by a wall of fire and started screaming at the operator to make the rail engine go faster. Alexia turned to see an unwanted sight. The hornets bounced off every surface of the rocky corridor, burning everything that had no right to be combustible. The alicorn cringed at the display. There's no possible way I could snuff that fire out. She regarded the cargo cart ahead of them. Leave the bastards to the hornets. The 4 agents ran past the cart with Conrad waving at them in their passing. See ya in hell, jerk asses. The passenger looked back with horror and grabbed the intercom that was linked to the other end of the tunnel. Go on without the last shipment, we're dead already and the whole place is going up in flames. Within moments, the 2 researchers and the crate were consumed by the ever-hungry hornets who showed no sign of stopping. Only a mild explosion of compressed gas marked the virus canister's destruction as well. The long wide tunnel stretched for 3 miles up an incline before the racing equines. Barely a mile in, the lighting failed as the power lines were burned through. They were left in darkness for only a moment until the silver mare lit the way with a forward-angled horn light. The passage itself was mostly barren save for the 2 heavy cargo carrier tracks that ran along the ceiling. Though they had not seen it in their flight, the passage led to other sections of the labs behind them. Every so often a piece of debris or uneven flooring had to be navigated by the ponies in their mad dash from the steadily encroaching fire hornets. While having a mixture of all 3 tribes within her might seem like a blessing to many, the Pegasi's speed and Earth pony's endurance hardly did the silver mare any good when she only routinely practiced unicorn magic over the others. As such, Toon was starting to lag behind even as she tried using her sore wings to give her frantic sprint a much-needed boost. Her muscles ached and screamed for oxygen, but still she pressed on with the others. Sweat clung to her fur and mane on the front while the racing hornets behind her kept her hindquarters bone dry and threatened to roast the end of her tail. Her horn lit up and the mare timed a blink forward when all four hooves were off the ground during her galloping gait. She dared not risk a mass teleport because the others would be momentarily dazed by it. It did, however, encourage them to go full tilt in their sprint now that they didn't feel the instinctual need to hold back for their alpha's sake. Every time they left the alicorn behind a few paces, she would blink forward again. This process repeated itself 5 times until a light could be seen on the far end. As they feared, the steel doors were sealed shut. The light they saw was the reflection of the fire behind them on the massive doors. All 4 ponies were panting heavily and running on nothing more than fear and adrenaline. Crimson flinched at another one of Alexia's blinks when it placed her side by side with the pale yellow mare. "Are we going to blind port through?" Toon spared a glance at the Hornets. The fire was scant inches behind them and seemed to accelerate even further at the prospect of finally having cornered 4 very combustible morsels. "It's our only chance." Anderson didn't want to look back. All she needed to know was that her tail was uncomfortably hot. Alexia stopped flapping her wings and held them in tight. "Get in close and hold on to your butts." The others followed the alicorn's lead and were about to smack into the steel doors when a brilliant flash of azure light saw them through to the other side. They found themselves inside a large underground hangar where a medium-sized cargo plane was throttling up to roar down the lit-up runway towards the dark night sky. The aircraft was in such a hurry to make off with its precious cargo that the back ramp was only just starting to raise up as the plane started its takeoff. "Oh no, you don't!" Before the others could even come close to regaining their wits, Toon teleported the 4 of them into an empty space above the canisters and 3 of the researcher Mayans and the 1 remaining unicorn. The momentum of the aircraft made the back ramp smack the ponies, and stalled its hydraulics. It groaned as it tried to finish closing and started to succeed once the 4 ponies were brought up to the aircraft's acceleration. "Kill them or get them off the plane," one of the female Mayans commanded as she ran towards the front to find a weapon, leaving 2 Mayans and 1 unicorn mare to safeguard the cargo. The unicorn tried to blast Crimson off the half-open ramp, but between the drowsiness of the 2 rapid teleports, the dead sprint for over 3 miles up an incline, and a sudden lurch in the aircraft, the mare could barely stand and flopped back down to the deck. The energy blast passed right over the prone mare and rent a hole large enough to see through. And what was visible through that hole stopped every hostile person from making a move. Alexia gulped and looked back to see the steel doors had been slagged and the fire hornets were already engulfing the back of the hangar, detonating the spare fuel tanks. As if spurred by the enticingly flammable lump of fuel encased in aluminum, the hornets chased after the fleeing aircraft with wild abandon. One of the Mayans took advantage of the distraction and kicked the lever to fully reopen the ramp and cut the rearmost canister loose so it would roll back and push the barely lucid agents to their demise. Toon saw what he was doing and barely managed to latch her kinesis onto the rolling cargo before it smacked into Conrad and the others. She found several guard wires and tried to wrap enough around the canisters so she could use her focus on offense. The unicorn fired a second kinetic blast at her, but Toon deflected it with a wave of her horn and the spell punched through the airframe, inflicting minor structural damage. The distraction was enough for the second Mayan to race forward and sacrifice himself by tackling the alicorn far enough to where they rolled back towards the edge of the ramp. At the same time, the aircraft tilted up as it crawled into the air, sending the rearmost canisters rolling back, and it pushed the 4 agents and 1 Mayan out of the aircraft and onto the desert sands. The 4 guard wires Toon managed to wrap around the canisters kept them from fully falling out after them, and the remaining Mayans and 1 unicorn fought to reel it back inside. The 4 ponies and 1 Mayan rolled far enough away from the entrance to the underground runway that when the fire hornets emerged into the open air they withered and died instead of roasting the 5 prone forms. The hornets left nothing behind save for grey ash. After the alicorn managed to stabilize their roll, she pinned the Mayan to the ground with her kinesis. He didn't bother struggling and let her press him into the sands while Toon checked on her mates. He let off a loud victorious chuckle as he fought against her magic to see the escaping aircraft. He didn't know if she spoke Equish, but decided to taunt her in it anyway. "Ha ha ha ha! You have failed, thralls of humanity. Soon your masters will be one with the Herald along with the rest of the world." Alexia lit the surrounding area with her magic and saw her mates were dusting themselves off. Exhausted, but in one piece. That great weight lifted from her withers and she was able to breathe a sigh of relief. She turned to the unresisting scientist who had a sneer plastered over his face. "Do what you will. My sacrifice has earned my place with the gods. I wouldn't bet on it. You guys lost the moment we found this place." She grabbed a radio from her harness and adjusted the frequency. "Bravo Actual, this is Charlie 1. The scientist's mirth froze over as he couldn't hear the other end of the conversation. "Package is on board the bogie retreating from my position. We are not on board. I repeat, we are not on board." A few moments later, the distant sound of fighter craft could be heard high above. Two fast-moving points of light appeared and streaked down towards the cargo aircraft. Twin flashes of light later, the plane came down with a sudden case of missing wing. It careened into the flat desert ground a flaming mess and dragged along the soft sands for quite a distance before finally coming to a rest. A few seconds after that, 4 incendiary bombs were dropped, 2 on the wreckage and 2 on the long drag mark in the sands. Nothing remained except for fire and charred scraps of metal. Alexia turned back to the dumbstruck Mayan. She heard the fighter pilot's calm chatter. "Target neutralized, nothing left but a smoking crater." The Bush's mission control responded. "Good work Arrow 3. Hang loose Charlie 1, evac is inbound." "Copy that Bravo." When she turned back around to the Mayan, he wasn't wearing the expression she was expecting of him. Instead of fear, anger, outrage, or even disappointment, he possessed a look of complete indifference. "So. One is lost," he said at length as he stared at the moonlit smoke before facing what he perceived as an orange unicorn stallion. Alexia's aura array had permanently twisted the illusion enchantment and would need to be fixed later. What a shame. This was not the same voice the Mayan possessed earlier. It was calm, collected, and spoke with superiority. He would have made a gesture if the puppet were not restrained by Alexia's magic. "I have over a dozen more scattered throughout the world, your accomplishments tonight mean little." By now the other ponies were picking themselves back up with Crimson being closest and having heard the entire conversation. The thing she picked up on most was the voice was impossibly unstable. It fluctuated between unnaturally deep baritone to mid-range alto in a seamless transition that did not crack during speech. It most certainly did not sound like the Mayan's voice a few seconds ago. "Who are you?" The person in question regarded what he saw to be a ruby-red unicorn stallion. His voice matched his image. The Mayan thought about his answer for a few seconds as he studied the disguised ponies, unable to pierce the veil of their harnesses' enchantments. "I am called many things by my flock, annoyingly so at times, but it hardly matters. You however may call me the Herald of the Quarry Dust, and you have garnered my attention." Author's note. Realistically it would have taken between 6 to 10 songs to get to the server room, but I wasn't going too far into realism for that. End author's note. End chapter 4. Fire Hornets.